Okay, let's dive right in. Today, we are unpacking a really complex legal battle, a story about land, homes, and history that took more than a decade to sort out. It's a case that pits family legacy right up against the letter of the law.
Now, this isn't just some thought experiment. This is the real human question at the very heart of a major legal case in Taiwan. It set dozens of families against a government council in a fight for their homes, their farms, their entire way of life.
So, on one side, you have the Council of Indigenous Peoples. They're a government body, and they're arguing that these families are illegally occupying protected land. But on the other side are the families themselves, and their argument is, hey, we've been here for decades. Some of our ancestors were here before this land was even officially registered. So you've got this collision, right? Formal legal rights versus a long lived-in reality. So to really understand how this all shook out, we're going to follow the case step by step. We'll trace it from the very first lawsuit through all the dramatic twists and turns in the courts, and all the way to the final verdict and what it all means. All right, first things first, we need to set the stage for this conflict. Because to really get what's at stake, you have to understand exactly what kind of land we're talking about. See, the land at the center of all this isn't just any random piece of real estate. It's what's known as indigenous reserved land. That means it's state-owned, sure, but it's been specifically set aside by law to protect the livelihoods of indigenous communities. And it's managed by the Council of Indigenous Peoples, which is why they were the ones who had to bring the lawsuit. It was literally their legal duty.
So the legal battle officially gets going in 2012. But the story of how these families ended up on this land, well, that goes back much, much further. Let's take a look at the timeline.
You have to picture this. Way back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, families began settling here, building lives, putting down roots. But while all that was happening, the land's legal status was being formalized, registered by the state as protected indigenous territory. For decades, these two things just existed side by side until 2012, when, bam, the official status led to a lawsuit that forced a confrontation. So the first time a court weighs in, the Taitong District Court, nobody gets a clear win. It's a split decision. The court sided with the council on some points, telling some families they had to tear down their homes and pay up, but it didn't agree with the council on everything. This messy outcome was really the first sign that this was going to be an incredibly tough, emotionally charged case. Okay, let's move on, because this next stage is where the story takes a huge unexpected twist. The families appealed, and in 2017, the High Court's decision just completely flipped the script. Wow. The Hualien High Court just threw out the lower court's decision. It sided 100% with the families. And it didn't do it based on some tiny detail of property law. No, it went big, arguing from broad human rights principles that the state actually had a duty to protect the family's right to have a home and a job. The court's thinking really boiled down to two key ideas. First up was this thing called the trust protection principle. The court looked at old government land records that had notes on them like approved for lease. And they said, look, these notes created a legitimate expectation for these families. In the court's eyes, the families had a right to trust those signals from the government. And the second piece of this puzzle was the abuse of rights principle. Here, the court basically said, hold on, forcing these families off their land without any compensation or plan for what comes next, that would cause tremendous harm for a relatively small public gain. They saw it as an unfair use of power. For the families, you can imagine this was a massive, massive victory. But hold on. The story was not over yet. Not by a long shot. The Council of Indigenous Peoples appealed again, taking this fight all the way to the top, to the Supreme Court. And in 2019, the highest court in the land stepped in to really scrutinize the High Court's reasoning. Now, this is where you see this incredible legal chess match play out. The Supreme Court looked at the High Court's logic and just took it apart, piece by piece. On the trust protection argument, they said, nope, that approved release note was an internal government memo, not a public promise. And on the abuse of rights claim, they said, the council is legally required to manage this land.
Fulfilling that duty isn't an abuse of rights. It's their job. So it all boiled down to this one single crucial point. Under the law, once land is officially registered as state property, you can't gain legal ownership just by living on it for a long, long time. It doesn't matter how many generations. That principle of property law was more powerful than the family's historical claims.
And this quote from the Supreme Court's ruling just hammers the point home. That note in a government file, it could not become the basis of the defendant's trust. This one sentence basically pulled the rug out from under the High Court's entire decision. And it sent the case back down for a retrial, but this time with very, very clear instructions on how to rule.
So with those binding instructions from the highest court in the land, the case went back to the High Court. This was it, the beginning of the end of this incredibly long legal saga. I mean, just look at this journey. Talk about legal whiplash. The case just ping-ponged through the courts for 12 full years. A split decision, then a total victory for the families, then a complete reversal by the Supreme Court, which set the stage for the final rulings that would finally bring it all to a close. From here, the end of the road was pretty much set in stone. It was a clear three-step process. First, the Supreme Court set the precedent. Second, the High Court in its retrial had to apply that precedent, which meant ruling for the council. And third, a final appeal by the families was denied, which made that verdict final. Game over. So, after more than a decade of fighting in court, the final judgment was absolutely conclusive. The families lost. They were ordered to tear down their homes and farms, give the land back, and even pay compensation for the years they'd been using it. So, the legal case is officially closed. But what are the lasting lessons here? After this long and, for so many people, heartbreaking dispute, what are we supposed to take away from all this? Well, from a purely legal perspective, this case clarified some really critical ideas. It told us that trust protection needs a real public promise from the government, not just some notes in a file. It established that when a government agency is just doing its job, that's not an abuse of rights. And maybe most importantly, it reinforced that you can't claim registered state land just by occupying it. In the end, the very specific laws about indigenous reserved land won out over the broader human rights arguments. And that leaves us right here. While the legal questions are all answered, the ink is dry, this case leaves behind a much bigger, much deeper question for all of us. The law is clear, but when that clear law collides with generations of human history, with livelihoods, with the very meaning of home, how do we, as a society, find the right balance? That is a question that no court can answer for us.